Today, it's the Ohio State Buckeye 2015 national champions. So I feel like we have some ducks in the crowd. Sorry about your loss. I went to Ohio State for my master's degree. They won when I was in school there, and I still say we have the cutest mascot in all of college football with Brutus, wouldn't you? I mean, who has a Buckeye, a fighting Buckeye? It's so cool. Anyway, go Bucks, and we'll see how they do next year. And third string quarterback, Cardale Jones, he should be starting next year. All right, so moving on to business. Horrifying fact number one, when you put a tree in the landscape, the average life expectancy is somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 12 years. 8 on the low end, some studies have said it's maybe 12 to 15 years. But regardless, when we plant trees in our urban environments, and you can think about how difficult our urban environments are with compacted soils, maybe not enough water, vandalism, things like that, it's pretty remarkable that our trees last as long as they do. So average life expectancy is 8 to 12 years. And of course, when we plant trees, we expect them to live for much longer. So there are really several reasons for this. And of course, the big one I'm going to be discussing is the practice of planting and what we can do to practice or plant correctly in order to have good longevity in the landscape. But there are numerous other reasons: tree genetics, nursery practices, compromised root systems. There's a lot that goes into getting the tree to the landscape when then you plant it. So consider all of those things, but if you're able to plant it correctly, you're starting the tree off for really great success later. So why do we plant trees? Well, we like to beautify our landscapes. We like to give our clients and our parks somewhere nice. We love shade. Some trees, of course, give us fruit, and they give us edible things. They give us wildlife habitat, but what I want to emphasize here is that you should really never just plant a tree because. So even if you lost a tree, don't necessarily just replace it because there was a tree there. Think about the entire landscape. Think about if a tree makes sense. Maybe you have other maturing trees nearby. You're starting to get shade issues, so make sure you're planting a tree with a direct purpose in mind, because all of you know that trees are not no maintenance. And I would argue that they're really not low maintenance. They require watering, mulching, pruning, maybe fertilization, and all of those things. So have a good purpose when you plant a tree. So the goal of planting is to eliminate post-planting stress or transplant shock, which you've probably heard. And this is what I like to say is when the tree is planted and then it sits in pouts for a number of years. So you put it in, you expect it to grow. You plant fast-growing trees, perhaps like cottonwoods and things like that, and you want that vigorous growth. Well, you may not get that for 2, 3, 4 years after planting, and so that's what's attributed to transplant shock, and that's from having the tree have to regenerate its root system from harvest in the field when it was shipped, or maybe to overcome some barriers during the planting process. So I don't think I need to tell you guys. I do have to remind my homeowners of this, but really before you do anything, make sure you get your utilities located. It's the safe thing to do, it's free, and all of you I'm sure have 811 memorized, but make sure you call or log in to have your utilities located before you actually start digging, so to save your life, and maybe some money too, if you hit something. So I'm gonna run through the 9 steps of tree planting. It's pretty extensive, but the first step is we really need to determine how deep our planting hole is going to be. So at this point, we haven't picked up a shovel, we haven't done anything. We need to look at the tree we have and we need to determine how deep the hole needs to be. And there are 2 things that go into this. So the depth of the root ball in the planting hole, so that's actually how deep the hole is, and then where that root system is located in the root ball. And so in this photo, this is a perfectly planted tree. We have roots that are distributed equally throughout the root system. We have structural roots near the top of the root ball, and that's what we want to look at. Sometimes we get trees that are planted too deep when we receive them, so they've been planted too deep in the nursery, and we receive them and they're still planted too deeply, and so we really need to look at that before we start digging our hole. Horrifying fact number 2 in Chicago, this is a fairly old study, but they found that about 2/3 of the trees were planted too deeply. And I'm from Minnesota, so you can laugh at the stupidity that the Minnesotans are here. If you're waist deep in a hole and the tree is even deeper than you are, that might be just a tad too deep. I'm just saying. So that's too deep, but we are getting better. But planting too deeply can lead to a lot of problems later on. And I would say that, you know, it's kind of a Goldilocks theme. It can't be too deep, it can't be too shallow. It really needs to be just right. But it's very easy to plant too deep because we have equipment. We don't necessarily take the steps to measure the root ball or the depth of the root ball. And so we need to really look at that. But once you plant a tree too deep, they're getting into levels of low soil oxygen. So that root system, just like you and I, it needs oxygen in order to survive and develop properly, okay? So it needs oxygen. And where there are better levels of soil oxygen is at the surface of our soil profiles. So in our heavy clay soils, as you get deeper, the pore space gets smaller. Smaller pore space means there's less area between those soil particles, and that's where the oxygen is, and the water for that matter. And so as you get deeper, pore space becomes smaller and oxygen becomes less available. And so we want to put those roots in the top profile of the soil. And most roots in our heavy clay soils are about 12 inches deep. And if you're working in a heavy compacted clay soil, maybe up to 75% of the roots are only 6 inches deep. So they're not very deep at all. But that's where those roots need to grow so that they have adequate soil oxygen. If we plant too deep, you'll start to see decline from the top down, and eventually the roots can't support the top of the tree, and so it will lead to the tree's death. Another thing with planting too deep is that we get trunk girdling roots. So think of trunk girdling roots as boa constrictors around the base of the tree, or a necktie, if any of you are wearing a necktie today. You know, the tighter you get, the more uncomfortable it becomes. And for the tree, as that root grows and enlarges, it's difficult for the tree to continue to transport the water and nutrients up and down the xylem and the phloem in the outer portion of the bark. Okay, so those trunk girdling roots can occur because the tree is going to grow where there's good soil oxygen. Oftentimes that means within the planting hole itself, and so that's where the good soil oxygen is. So those roots keep circling around and around, and these roots can appear above ground, as you see in the photo, but oftentimes they're below ground, and so they'll continue to enlarge, and you could lose a mature tree 10, 15, 20 years down the road because of these trunk girdling roots. And so this also leads to tree decline and potentially tree death. So that's something. And it's really hard to determine if it is a root issue. And we speculate a lot in extension that it could be a root issue, but we don't know for sure because we don't have fancy equipment to do scanning photographs of the soil below. If you're into making things or inventing things, that might be something really cool to do. So what we want to avoid is the telephone pole tree. So this tree is planted too deeply because it's a straight trunk up and down in the ground. So make sure you avoid that. And trees should have a root flare. They should have that nice flare out at the base, and that's where those structural roots start to grow. So this tree is planted properly. Telephone pole trees are planted too deep, and so we'll give this a creepy thumbs up for being planted correctly. On the flip side, if we plant too shallowly, those roots are going to be open to freeze and thaw, and we've had some good freeze and thaw, so it's been pretty cold. We're going to get into the 60s by the end of the weekend, and if you have roots above ground, those roots will be exposed to that freeze thaw. They could get exposed to drying winds, hot temperatures, and so we really, again, need to have the tree planted at the correct level, not too deep, not too high, and have it correctly so that those roots have a good environment in order to grow properly. So when we do dig our planting hole, which we'll get to in the next step, it's very important that before you put the tree in the ground, the tree is sitting on undug or firmed soil. Down here, that soil can't be fluffy. If it's nice and fluffy, what happens with gravity? It's going to sink. And then what is your tree? Planted too deep. Ugh. So make sure that when you're digging your hole, you either leave the soil undug at the base, or you go in and lightly stomp it down with your foot to pack that soil down so that when you water and the weight of the root ball comes down, it's not going to sink into the ground. So make sure that your root ball is sitting on undug or firm soil. Also, and we'll talk about the backfill, but in the backfill process, make sure you don't put any backfill over the top of the root ball. And this is different, and it's very important, and the same thing goes for mulch. But the reason for this is that if you have soil or mulch on top of the root ball, water is going to find the least path of resistance around and move through the pore space. So you have this soil, this backfill soil that you have taken out, so there's good pore space in your backfill. And if you put that on top and you water, likely water is going to skirt around the root ball and go below, but it's unlikely that the water is going to go into the root ball itself. And so following planting, you should see the top of the root ball above grade, okay? You should see it slightly above grade. And I realize this gives you the heebie-jeebies. I know that it's weird because you don't want to see that root ball there. It's a different soil texture, it's a different color, and it's strange, but we need to ensure that when we water, we're actually watering the root ball so the root ball doesn't dry out and not just watering the backfill soil around it, okay? So following planting and before we mulch, the top of the root ball should sit 1 to 2 inches above grade, depending on the size of tree you're planting. So if you're planting smaller trees, a 1-inch caliper tree, that's just the diameter of the trunk. If you're planting a 1-inch caliper tree, your tree will sit 1 inch above grade. A 2 to 4-inch caliper tree, it will sit 2 inches above grade. I'm sorry. If you're planting anything larger, make it sit even a little bit taller. Okay, so a little bit higher above grade. But in general, we're planting trees in the 1 to 4-inch caliper range, so 1 to 2 inches. And this is what it will look like. Okay, it's not as obvious as you might think. And remember, this is before we mulch or we do anything else. So we're seeing that root ball sit slightly above grade because when we go back and water, we don't need to water the entire area around the tree immediately following planting. We just need to apply water to that root ball to help get those roots growing and rehydrated. So hopefully that makes sense. So how do you measure the tree to sit 1 to 2 inches above grade? Now I realize it's Tuesday, I realize this is math, but it's not really hard math because it's just simple subtraction. So if you have a root ball that's 14 inches tall, and that's from top to bottom, okay, your root ball is measuring 14 inches tall top to bottom. It's a 2-inch caliper tree. How high does it sit above grade? 2 inches. So how deep is your hole? Hopefully you said 12. 14 minus 2 is 12. So the depth of your hole with the firm soil will be 12 inches deep. So you guys will actually save a little bit of time and labor if you measure the depth of the root ball prior to digging your hole, because you don't have to dig 2 extra inches. That's pretty good. And in some soils, you can probably be grateful not to have to dig 2 extra inches. The one thing to check before you actually get the tree in the ground is to look for those structural roots. So those structural roots are those big, beefy roots at the top of the root system. Those are the ones that start the root flare, that nice flare at the base as the tree matures. And you can check for these. So just take a slender screwdriver or whatever you have that's nice and thin, and you can gently poke the top of the root ball. And if you hit something hard, a couple inches down, that's going to be one of your structural roots. Now, for the most part, our nursery growers are doing an excellent job and our trees are planted properly. But sometimes during the digging process, extra soil might be added to the top, and you might need to adjust for that and remove it so that you have those structural roots right at the surface of the root ball. So if the tree is too deep, just simply adjust it. You're going to raise the depth of your planting hole, so you'll make your hole a little bit more shallow, and then you'll scrape off the top to have those structural roots essentially sitting right at grade when you're finished. All right, that was step 1. Whew, it involved math, and that's scary, I know. So step 2 is to dig a saucer-shaped hole 3 times the root ball diameter. And I realize that I'm standing here talking to a group of industry professionals, and for the most part, you have been told to plant things twice as big, right? And I understand that and respect it absolutely. The science, and that's what I'm here to present, the science tells us that 3 times the root ball diameter is better for the tree long term. But I know that you have a lot of things on your plate, and digging a hole 3 times as wide is going to take more time, more labor, more everything. And we'll talk about the differences between 2 and 3 times. So the science tells us 3 times, and that's what the current recommendation is. But saucer-shaped is really important. And so saucer-shaped, and this is going to be tip to tip, so it's going to act like a shallow saucer. The saucer and the sides, the slope sides of that planting hole are going to bring roots up into areas of better soil oxygen. Okay, so it's going to gradually lead those roots up. It's not going to lead to more surface roots, which are a pain in the landscape. There are trees that will surface root regardless. Maples are one, cottonwoods are one, but having a saucer-shaped planting hole doesn't lead to surfacing roots. It's just going to lead those roots into areas where they can grow better. If you dig with an auger, and I would say by all means, absolutely use equipment if you have it available. With an auger, you're going to likely dig a cylindrical hole, and that's fine. Just make sure you go back and shape those sides into saucer-shaped when you're finished, or before you finish the hole itself and before you put the tree in the ground. So make sure you still make it saucer-shaped. And with using equipment, again, it's really easy to make the hole too deep, so make sure you're checking the depth before you put the tree in the ground. I used an auger to dig, to plant the research trees I just finished at CSU, and it was a joy. It was great, so absolutely use that equipment. So the width of the planting hole, and again, 3 times as wide as the root ball, and that's just measuring across the top of the root ball and multiplying by 3, that is going to be key to the rapid root development. So again, these trees are dug from a field if you're planting B&B trees. They're dug from a field. Up to 95% of its existing roots are left in the field, and you get this tree with 5% of its root system. It has the same top, but it only has 5% of the root system. And so we're setting this tree up for success so that it can regenerate the root system and begin growth shortly after the tree is planted. Regardless of what you do, you could dig a hole that's 10 times as wide as the root ball. When those roots hit our native site soils, they're going to slow down. But the point is that in that planting hole itself, we're going to regenerate enough roots that it's going to not hinder the growth of the tree in the above ground canopy. Okay? So we want to make sure that that hole is big enough to do that. So if we make our hole 2 times as wide, this is generally where the industry is, we will get 150% by volume root regeneration. This is really good. Unfortunately, research has shown that it still leads to that transplant shock or post-planting stress. So while we are getting new roots developing, we are still getting that root growth slow and affecting the top growth of the canopy. So we'll have some delays in growth above ground. If you can make that hole 3 times as wide and put in the extra labor, the root growth by volume is going to grow to 400% of its original root system. So that's a big difference, 150% to 400%. The growth is going to slow, but this slowed growth, because we have such a strong root system behind it, it's not going to lead to transplant shock or post-planting stress following planting. Okay? So that's what the science has presented us. So 2 times, I would say, is the absolute minimum that you can do. 3 times is better. If you can go 4, 5, 6, more power to you. Have fun digging, but that would be even better for the tree long term. But I understand that you have a lot of things to balance. It takes more time and labor. You have to educate people. There's a lot that goes into it, and so those are what you need to balance. Are we looking to avoid post-planting stress? Do we need to look where our business can still be successful? And you need to look at those components as well individually. So there's our hole. So it's saucer-shaped all the way around in all directions, tip to tip. And I've also been asked, can you chop away at the sides? Because as you start to dig, you usually glaze the sides of the planting hole. yeah, you can go in and try to scuff those up a little bit to have the roots have more opportunity to go through some of those scuffing. Again, it takes more time and labor. And roots, they're pretty good at getting through some tough situations. I mean, they grow through concrete sidewalks and everything else. So, but yes, you can absolutely do that. And then as you're digging your hole, you're checking the width. So lay something across. I've worked closely with the town of Windsor, and I know Blake here in the audience. Hey, Blake. He actually has a bamboo stick that has measurements marked off. So instead of bringing out a tape measure, he just brings that width and measures his hole. And then as you're digging, it's very easy to go deeper and start digging out the bottom. And so make sure you're checking the depth of the planting hole. So lay something flat across, like the bamboo stick or a shovel, and then measure up from the base, from the flattened portion or the undug soil, so that you're not getting too deep as you're shaping the sides of the hole itself. All right, so step 3 is to set the tree in place and remove the container, the wrappings. We'll talk about burlap and things like that. So we'll go through the generic steps of planting a B&B tree. These are very generic. So outside of the planting hole, make sure that you remove any extra wrappings. If you pick this tree out by hand, they might have tagged it with ribbon. It might have a tree or a trunk guard during the shipping process. You can remove that. But make sure that you leave anything on that's actually holding the root system together. Okay, so don't take off the burlap and the wire basket outside of the hole, because likely it will shatter as you're moving it in. But anything else you can remove. It might be easier for you to remove the bottom portion of the wire basket, especially if it's a tapered wire basket where it comes to more of a point. It might be easier to remove that outside, so you can remove the couple bottom rungs of the wire basket. The tree itself will still hold together well. You don't need to worry about removing the burlap at the time, but just those few bottom rings. The next step is to set the tree in place, looking closely at, are we at the right level? Do we need the hole to be bigger? Do we need the hole to be deeper? And then we're going to check the depth. So again, you can lay something flat across that's going to be next to the root system and laying on grade at the ground, and you can see, does it sit 1 to 2 inches above grade? And this is where it's going to be the most uncomfortable for you, because it's going to look like a sore thumb. It's going to stick out very significantly. But again, we haven't mulched yet, and so just remember that point. Make sure you align it, and so step away, look at it from several angles, because once the tree is in the ground, it's really hard to correct a leaning tree, or make sure you look at it from a couple of different sides. And then for stability, you can form a shallow ring of soil around the base of the root ball. And if you do this step, in most cases, it will eliminate the need for staking. You may not need to stake if you do this step. And the reason for this, we're just taking a little bit of soil and forming essentially a donut around the base, just a couple inches up the side of the root ball. And what that does is it actually keeps the tree in place. And so if it does get rocked by wind or things like that, that little donut is going to keep that tree from moving and shifting. It's amazing what this can do. So with my research trees, we planted 27 trees over each of 3 years, so it was a lot of trees by the end of it. We did this step, and we had deer and other things hit the trees, and we had wind, and we didn't lose a single tree from being tipped over. And Perk was located right across from the fraternities, and so they like to come over and play Frisbee and do things like that. But our trees stayed upright, and I would say that if staking is something that you routinely do, maybe introduce this step and see how your trees fare, okay? Evergreens might be a different matter, especially if you're planting evergreens into the summer and even fall months, just because of the weight of the top of the canopy. You might still need to stake, but we'll talk about staking and some of the hiccups it has and some of the problems that can occur to the tree. But consider trying this step and just form this shallow ring of soil around the base. After you do that, then you can cut the rest of the wire basket off. You can remove the rest of the burlap, and I would advocate that you take it all off. If you can only remove the upper 2/3 or 12 inches, that's going to work, because again, those are where those roots are going to start to grow out. The roots at the very bottom of the root ball and the planting hole, not as important, okay? Not as important for tree growth. But again, if you can take it all off, the more the better, because why introduce roots to something to hinder growth later on? So take it off if you can. So be sure to remove the burlap. It's slow to decompose if it ever decomposes. We're talking years and years and years, and the roots will be far beyond that point. And I would say it's hard to take off burlap without removing the wire basket on top of it. A little bit tricky. Remove the twine, because twine can act like a girdling root. It can start to cut into the flesh of the tree itself and can hinder growth. And then remove the wire basket. If we were living in Iowa or Illinois, Indiana with more acidic soils, you can maybe have a wire basket decompose in 15 to 20 years. But we're looking at long term with our high pH soils. So remove everything. And I would say that because you're taking the time to plant this tree properly, don't leave things on that could interfere with growth short term and potentially long term as well. And then if you have any roots, so after you remove the wire basket and burlap, if you have roots that are broken, that are exposed, that have dehydrated during the transport process, you can absolutely remove those. And that is B&B planting, and then we'll go into backfill for the rest of them. For containerized trees, it's pretty much the same thing, except we have a container on the outside of the root system instead of burlap and wire. So with containerized trees, if it's a well-rooted container tree, the root system is going to stay together when you remove the container. Okay? So you can take the container off outside of the hole, wiggle it off as gently as you can. And I do stress that even if a container is touted as biodegradable, if it's a paper pulp pot or anything like that, take it off, because again, we have more alkaline soils that don't rapidly decompose. And decomposition requires water, which we generally don't have a lot of. And so take all the containers off, even if it's supposed to be biodegradable. After you take the container off, this is a great time to look at the root system. And this is where circling or girdling roots can become the first problem, especially when they're container grown. So often, I know all of you have removed a tree or a tomato or something from a container, and you see the root system wrapping around the outside of the container. It's at this point that you need to correct it, because if you don't, those roots will continue to circle. It's not as if the roots one day wake up and say, ooh, I'm circling, but really I should be growing laterally. I think I'll do that instead. Unfortunately, roots aren't that smart, and so you really need to correct those girdling roots or circling roots by doing one of three things. So the first is kind of the old time recommendation, and that's just to make butterfly cuts about 1.5 inches deep into the side of the root ball. So you're making several slits in a vertical manner to slice those roots, okay? The second option is to shave off the outer 1 to 1.5 inches of the root system. And this is something that Dr. Gilman from Florida has introduced. I'm sure you've seen his work before. So shave off the outer portion, so you're actually removing those roots completely. Or you can also cut the root system into a box. So you're making 4 cuts on the sides, and again, removing that root system. This was a study that another Dr. Gilman did when he was at the University of Minnesota. And it is published on a blog, so you can absolutely check this out. So he decided to look at the slicing or scoring, the butterfly technique, versus some of these other removal techniques. And so he sliced and scored, and then he planted trees. He planted both shrubs and trees into the landscape, and then looked at the root systems 5 years later. So this was a slicing and scoring technique, and you can look at this root system. Is that a root system that you think would be something you'd want to see in the landscape? Do you see any potential problems there? Yeah, hopefully you're seeing that these roots are already really tight next to the trunk, and those are what could form into those girdling roots in another 5 or 10 years and lead to a compromised root system and lead to tree failure. When he looked at shaving or boxing the root ball, and again, you would use a pruning saw, a reciprocating saw, and again, you're just taking off about 1 inch of the outer portion of the root system all the way around and also off of the bottom, It's easy to do. Or the box cut. This is the root system that he had 5 years after planting. And so if you compare those two, the slicing technique versus the boxing technique, which root system would you prefer? Hopefully it's a no-brainer, and you're looking at the boxing technique. And what I liked about Dr. Gilman's study in Minnesota was that this was tested on soils that are much more similar to ours. Minnesota might have slightly better soils, but they're not the sandy soils that the other Dr. Gilman in Florida was dealing with. And I think soil texture and structure has a lot to do with root system development. So this study from the University of Minnesota is showing promise, and there's also another study going on at Michigan State University looking at very similar techniques, and they've added different components as well. So consider trying the boxing or shaving technique. Again, it's hard to change our practices, and maybe not change everything right away, but try a couple trees and see how they do, or see if it actually works with the time and labor that it takes to do that. So after you correct the root system, tilt the tree into place, verify the correct depth, and again, the tree is going to sit 1 to 2 inches above grade, and if you need to adjust, make sure you do so at the time. Align it, check it vertically from several angles, just like you would with a B&B tree, and then just like the B&B, firm that shallow ring of soil around the base of the root ball to keep that root ball in place during high wind weather. The last planting technique, this is the only slide I have. How many of you are planting bare root trees? I wonder if it's one that I can see. The lights are very glaring. Okay, my one friend, this is bare root planting for you. All you would really do is, it's the same principles, so you would have a saucer-shaped planting hole 3 times as wide as the root ball, or as the root system itself. You would firm a shallow, or you'd firm a mound of soil in the root ball itself. So this is going to be a firm mound. You're going to pack that down. And then you're going to take those roots and drape them over that mound and have those structural roots, these big guys, right at soil grade. And then we plant it. With bare root trees, absolutely you're going to need to stake, because there's no way to keep that tree upright otherwise. You can try to pack some soil around the root system, but staking is necessary. And try bare root trees. They're often a little bit cheaper. You can see the root system, you can correct the root system, and there are some professors who actually recommend washing the entire root system before you plant a tree so that you can expose the skeleton of the roots and correct any sort of issues before going into the landscape. But bare root trees, they should be available usually mid-March to the end of April or so. So consider that. So we made it through getting the tree in the ground. The 4th step of tree planting is underground root stabilization. And I'm not going to be talking about this, but if you are actually doing this as a practice, I would love to talk to you. I don't think it's a very widely used practice, but this is actually where you are staking the tree below ground to keep the root system in place. And if you are doing this, you can go to our website and check out Garden Notes number 634. All right, so let's move into backfill. And backfill tends to be the one area where people have very strong opinions one way or the other, because they're very pro-amendment or they don't amend and they have their reasons why. So let's talk about backfill. So should you amend your backfill soil? In a perfect world, you would only backfill with your site soil available. You wouldn't add any compost, peat moss, root stimulator, growth hormones, any of those products. You would backfill with just the site soil. And what you would do is you would add some backfill, you would water it in and let that settle, add more backfill, water it in, let that settle. And so it's kind of a layering process, okay? And it's best if you don't go in there and stomp it down with your feet or water pack it or pack it down tightly. Just let the water do the natural settling of the soil itself. You can use your shovel to break up some of those big clods, of course. So in the backfill, again, remember our root ball is going to sit 1 to 2 inches above grade, and I mentioned very early on that we don't want any backfill to cover the top of the root ball, but we do want backfill covering the knees of the root system. And so the knees are where that root system starts to shape down, okay? It's kind of like the shoulders of the root ball. So you're going to cover to the knees, but not over the top of the root system. So let's discuss amending with organic matter. If you're a homeowner and you go to a garden center and you purchase a tree, generally there's a recommendation that you buy clay buster or peat moss or something that you add to the backfill soil. And I'm not saying this is wrong, but we're going to look at it again from a scientific perspective to see if it's necessary. And really the professionals are divided on the benefits. So those of you working in the industry, some of you always amend, some of you never amend, and you have your reasons for why you do. Well, Linda Chalker-Scott, who's actually going to be speaking later this week, I would suggest you check out her talk. She's a really dynamic speaker. She's from Washington State University, and she has this wonderful website called theinformedgardener.com. And her thing is to debunk those horticultural myths that we have floating around our industry and in the land of homeowners. And so she has one on the myth of soil amendments. And I love her opening line that of the fictions in popular horticulture, none are as deceptive as this one. And if you go in and read her paper further, no scientific studies to date show any measurable benefit of adding soil amendments except in containerized plant production. And she goes on to say, plants grown in native soil showed better root establishment and more vigorous growth. Huh, okay, and you can definitely go ahead and Google The Informed Gardener and read that. So if you have a soil test done, the recommendation for organic matter in your soil is 5%, right? That's the magic number of organic matter that you should have. So if you have your soil tested on your site and you get your soil test back and it has maybe 2 to 3% organic matter, bumping that up to get to 5% is going to be okay. If you have adequate organic matter, really it's not likely that you're going to do anything. If you replace half of the native soil with an organic material, peat moss, compost, whatever you pick, you are essentially creating a larger container for that tree in the planting hole. So you're going to have probably better growth short term, but worse growth, I would argue, as those plants start to reach into our native soils, okay? So maybe better growth short term, but you're not going to have the long-term benefit of adding 25 to 50% organic matter. And the thing with organic matter is that it can hold too much moisture, okay? It's going to hold a lot more moisture than our native soils. And it's going to decompose over time, so you're actually going to lose volume in your planting hole, okay? So really, the bottom line is that amending your soils is going to be less important than if you follow the first 3 steps more closely. So having a saucer-shaped planting hole, making sure it's 3 times as wide as the root ball, and making sure it's planted at the proper grade. Those are much more important than relying on organic matter to help your tree grow and survive in the landscape. Okay? Let's discuss staking. So this is a major oops. I serve on the tree board in Windsor, and last year's calendar we did 12 ways to kill a tree, so each month we featured how you can kill a tree. It was a really enlightening, uplifting calendar, I have to say. This year's theme is much more positive. But this was actually a photo from one of our fellow board members from his HOA. I think it was actually in his yard. But this is what happens because stakes, they're great because obviously they're going to hold the tree upright, but the problem with stakes is that we forget they're there and we forget that they need maintenance. And so this can happen very easily where the straps or the wire becomes embedded into the trunk of the tree, especially if you forget to have them on the maintenance plan to remove 1 or 2 years after you put them in. Okay, so stakes may not be necessary, and again, we have to ask ourselves, so are we staking the tree because it's habit, because it's what we always done, or is there actually a need? So again, if you're sitting your tree or setting your tree on unfirmed or undug soil, or firmed or undug soil, and you make that shallow donut at the base, for the most part, staking isn't going to be necessary. However, if you are planting your tree in high traffic areas, so near a place where people play soccer all the time, or there's just a lot of traffic, if the tree can't stand up on its own, and in that case, I don't think you should be planting the tree. If it's a floppy trunk, just send it back to the nursery where it came from. Or if you have a really windy site, and don't just argue that, oh, I live in Colorado or Wyoming, I have a windy site. It needs to be like a truly windy site. So if you have any of those 3 criteria, then staking could be necessary, but you are only leaving those staking straps on for 1 season. Maybe 2, but even current research has found that leaving the stakes on longer than 1 growing season has proved damaging to the tree itself, where we're starting to get girdling into the trunk itself. One tip I learned from a forester in the group was that they may not apply the staking straps, but they actually put down the poles, and for some reason, the rebar poles, and for some reason that indicates to people driving by or playing in the area that that tree needs a little bit of protection around there. So maybe put in the rebar, but don't actually apply the stakes. Now, if you stake, keep the stakes at least 15 to 18 inches away from the trunk itself. This may mean that you're pounding them into the planting hole. And of course, use those flat canvas straps. Using wire through garden hose or just using plain wire has proven to be very damaging, and those canvas straps can be reused for several growing seasons, and just thread your wire through the grommets at the end. So again, question why you're staking, try the donut method and see if that works. If it doesn't work, then absolutely go ahead and continue to stake, but leave them on for maximum of 2 growing seasons, but really it should just be 1. Step 7, water to settle the soil. This may take you days to actually complete this process, depending on how long it takes to drain. Step 8 is to do your final grade. So when you do your final grade, remember you should still see that root ball once you finish your final grade. And step 9 is mulch. So I love this quote from Tim Buchanan: "Good things happen to people who mulch." He's from the city of Fort Collins Forestry. So why should you mulch? Well, you've probably seen this if you've been around any horticulture outing in the last 20 years. This is a study done at the Morton Arboretum back in the late 1980s. And it's really interesting. So they had several trees planted, some in grass, some in mulch. And what they found with the trees that were mulched is that they actually had greater fine root development in the root system. And so fine roots are the ones that are absorbing water and nutrients, and those are the ones that grow and reproduce rapidly, so that's good for tree establishment. They also found better top growth, and the biggest thing is that mulch keeps equipment away, okay? Then you don't bang it with your lawnmower or your string trimmer. And I know that mulching has challenges of its own. I know it blows away. I know it needs to be replaced. I know you have to do something about the grass that grows up into it. But mulch does wonders. And this is a newer study out of Michigan State University. So ignore the treatments, the non-shave teas. Ignore that and just look at the bars. So the black bars are the trees that were mulched, and we're looking at stem caliper growth. So the amount of caliper that those trees have put on. And for every treatment, trees that were mulched versus trees that weren't mulched have greater stem caliper treatment, okay? Roots are going to build the caliper, and it's going to lead to better establishment in the landscape. So mulch is great. And so if you're chipping trees, keep the mulch. The mulch doesn't care if it's dyed black or red. It doesn't care if it was old Christmas trees. Just put down some type of organic material. But like the root ball, we're not going to mulch over the top of the root system, and make sure you keep that off. So again, we'll mulch to the area, but again, that root ball should be exposed, because as we water and come back, we need to make sure that we're watering the root system. And actually, some work that's been done, mulching over the top of the root ball has thought to lead to increased stem girdling roots is because the mulch has lots of pore space and oxygen available, plus it tends to hold moisture a little bit better. So those roots that come out of the root ball, they grow into the mulch layer and they start to grow best there. And especially if they're growing around the base of the tree where they come out of the root system, that's what can lead to stem girdling roots, and then you have a whole nother problem on your hands. So make sure that you keep mulch off the top of the root ball. If you're mulching mature trees, keep mulch at least 6 inches away from the base of the tree itself. Mulch over the backfill area and beyond, so you can mulch to the tip of the planting hole. 2 to 3 feet in either direction is going to work, but even 1 foot in either direction is going to give you protection from mowing equipment and things like that. Mulch 3 to 4 inches deep, and just know that mulch will be one of those things that you need to replace over time. So be sure to add some type of mulch. Just make sure to do it correctly and never, ever, ever do the mulch volcano. No mulch volcanoes. So to wrap it up, there is our tree in our planting hole. So again, sitting on undug or firm soil, 1 to 2 inches above grade, no mulch or backfill over the top of the root ball, saucer-shaped planting hole, and we're going to cover the knees with our backfill. And amendments, you can make your own decision. Hopefully you have some better information on that.